Everybody's back. We made it. This is great. Thank you. So up next, folks, let's go ahead and bring it in. We have Bob Martini. He's going to be going over some of the closeout for the consent order that we had a few years ago with SRS. So if you could, give me your attention. And remember, let's hold questions until the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Martini. I work for Savannah River Nuclear Solutions, and I'm the manager of the Nuclear and Criticality Safety Programs. I'm here to talk to you about the consent order, an incorporated agreement between the Department of Energy and my company. And this occurred, and it was executed in April of 2016. For our agenda today, obviously I'm going to go over the consent order and talk a little bit about the DOE Office of Enforcement, talk a little bit about some of the key consent order actions that we had, some of the reviews we did and their results, and then I'll move on to a summary. Included in your package is an acronym list. I will try my best to say them all out to not have you force you to use it, but if it's needed, it is there. Okay. Let me start with a status of where we are with our consent order. It's NCO 2016-01. It was implemented in April of 2016. The consent order is a settled agreement between DOE and SRS. The document includes facts and circumstances associated with potential non-compliances from the events that led to the SRS safety pause in the year 2015, and a remedy. The remedy included both monetary and corrective actions. To date, all the actions have been completed, and the final action closure documentation was provided to DOE in June of this year, and then ultimately DOE reviewed the action closure documentation, and they notified us in August of this year that they consider the matter closed. In here I am talking about DOE, but I am talking about a specific section of DOE. I'm talking about the Office of Enforcement, and the purpose of this presentation is to talk a little bit about them and the process we use to get to achieving closure of our consent order. Okay, with that, let me talk a little bit about the Office of Enforcement, their authority and purposes. I'm not a lawyer, but it kind of started off with the Atomic Energy Act, and it was supplemented by the Price-Anderson Amendment Act, and I'm sure there are a whole bunch of other ones in between that added and modified things. But ultimately, what those documents did and continue to do in law is give the Secretary of Energy the authority to establish rules and regulations necessary to ensure safe operations, and both for nuclear safety and security of nuclear activities and material. And on top of that, the second authority is to be able to levy penalties against DOE indemnified contractors if there are violations supporting these rules. DOE established the enforcement program as a method to implement this authority right here, the penalty part of this. And the DOE Office of Enforcement is the organization that implements that program for the Department of Energy. It is a method to ensure contractors comply with requirements and therefore ensure safety and security in execution of mission. In executing that responsibility, the Office of Enforcement really emphasizes and tries to promote contractors to implement management and compliance assurance attributes into their work processes to ensure that work is done safely and compliant with rules and requirements. Attributes of those insurance processes include performing rigorous self-assessments. Again, the contractors are the ones doing work. They're the closest to it. They're the ones who are more likely to identify deviations from what's going on versus what's required. Once you identify those non-compliances, then you need a corrective action system to record them in. You need to have processes to do appropriate issue investigation to understand what happened, how big is this problem, extent of condition reviews. And then you need to have a process to do causal analysis to get into why did it happen? And we need to fix both of those things, not just what happened, but why it happened to prevent recurrence. And then your programs need to have, again, they encourage the use of, in those processes, to develop sustaining corrective actions, not a quick fix, but actions that actually last a long time and they ensure your processes are operating correctly. And underpinning all that is to have a positive safety culture, a safety and security culture. Uh-oh. I'm on, but thank you. Oh, what just happened there? All right, thank you. Underpinning that, again, is to have a positive safety culture. This is, you know, from enforcement's perspective, it's looking at an organization that establishes an atmosphere that encourages employees to identify things and then takes actions to fix them. You know, an environment where they feel comfortable to report things and they're encouraged to do so and rewarded for that. Okay. In our case with the Office of Enforcement, a number of these documents for those events, again, that led to the safety pause were provided to OE. All of our corrective action plans, all of our causal analyses, you know, several years worth of self-assessments of our criticality safety program were provided. There were no comments on that, but it was just agreed to move forward that it was thought best that we have consent order was the appropriate mechanism to move forward with this particular situation. And the consent order invoked independent assessment actions outside of SRS to provide assurance that we were indeed doing these things that we talked about. So with that, our key actions from our consent order were basically, number one was to finish our corrective actions that we had identified and then perform an effectiveness review on them. And the second action was then to kind of take a step back and do a holistic review of our criticality safety program. Now, both of these actions have an element of, they asked us to have a party independent from our company to do that, to provide that additional assurance. Before I move on from number one, I just want to highlight something, again, in the term corrective action plan. Our corrective actions are really kind of two kinds, if you would. Again, I alluded to them earlier, but I just want to bring this up because it ties into the effectiveness review. Again, when something's broken, you know, we all know we need to fix it, right? So you have corrective actions that fix what's broken. And then there's a set of corrective actions that looks as to why did it break, and back to that theme of I need to fix why it broke so that it doesn't happen again. And those are what we refer to as preventative corrective actions. One of the methods we use is when we've implemented our preventative corrective actions, we go back after a little while and we do an effectiveness review. And what that does is it targets the preventative corrective actions and takes a hard look at them because you might do a great job of identifying why it went wrong, and then you believe you found the correct solution to make sure that you fixed it, but we go back and test that to make sure that we fixed it. So an effectiveness review is a key part of ensuring that we got the right actions in there, again, to tie into that theme of having sustaining corrective actions, as we talked about. Okay, let me move on to what we did for corrective action number one. Okay, for this action, we brought in two subject matter experts were hired to perform this review. They were both had expertise in conduct of nuclear operations and conduct of nuclear safety. Both gentlemen had 30 plus years of experience in the nuclear industry, primarily in the DOE complex, some with international experience as well. And they went in and looked at our corrective action plan and validated that all the actions were complete. They spent several weeks in the facility and they interviewed the operators, they watched the operations, they reviewed the procedures, they came in on night shift, on back shift, weekends, and watched a number of evolutions. They looked at, I did it again, excuse me, going the wrong way. Okay, I will figure this out. Yeah, let me try that one more time, excuse me. All right. So they looked at a number of evolutions on backshift throughout and whatnot. They performed interviews, document reviews, et cetera. And generally, right out of their report, they concluded that they found the staff to be competent, responsive, and dedicated to making changes. And ultimately, their conclusion was that they were doing an effectiveness review. They determined that our preventative actions were effective to prevent a future issue. This effort was completed in the early part of 2017, and the documentation package was sent to the Office of Enforcement in April of 2017 regarding this topic. Going back to consent order number 2, again, this was to conduct that independent criticality safety program assessment. When it came to who would be this party, it could not be associated with our company or our parent company. So in discussions with the Office of Enforcement, they suggested that we use this group. Their name is the Criticality Safety Support Group. And I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute, but that's the group we decided to do that. Within the consent order, there were 7 areas that were specifically targeted to be reviewed. 3 of them, there was a clause in there that said that the CSSE group could look at the contractor assessments in those areas, and if they determined that those reviews were sufficient, they didn't need to reassess those areas, and they could focus their attention on the other 4 areas. We're a learning organization. We want to make sure we're doing things right. We took this as an opportunity to perform our own internal assessment prior to them coming. Okay, one of our goals was maybe we could package those 3 items that were talked about to an acceptable level, and then they could focus their attention in the other 4 areas. So we took off and we went and did a complete internal program self-assessment right in accordance with the terms in the consent order internally ourselves. We refer to that as our pre-CSSG review, that again, before the Criticality Safety Support Group came to the site. Okay, in that, we took 4 assessors, and we took about 6 weeks, and we went to all of our nuclear facilities. And again, the kind of things you heard me talk about. They looked at procedures, they looked at issued documents, engineering technical documents, nuclear criticality safety evaluations. They watched operations in the field. They did reviews, again, weekends, nights. They covered all the shifts. They covered support organizations, et cetera. And basically, that review concluded that our program is sound in compliance with DOE and our own internal procedures compliance. We use the term finding to signify when something doesn't meet a requirement. In that entire review, they only found 1 finding. It was related to a person who had expired criticality safety training. We addressed that. And they found 22 opportunities for improvement across the range of improving training, improving our self-assessment program, making improvements in the common mode failure discussion in technical documents. They noticed some differences in consistency between areas on how detailed write-ups were, so they had some recommendations on sharing lessons learned so that we can get the right level of detail across the board in all the different facilities and have our documents meet, a consistent quality standard. And then some areas where we have our linking document database consistency. All of these actions we put into our corrective action program, and we are trying to make progress to improve our program further to incorporate these. Okay, this information from this review, along with all of our program documents and a laundry list of other documents, copies of self-assessments, et cetera, were all provided to the CSSC group, the Criticality Safety Support Group, ahead of them coming to the Savannah River site to perform their assessment at the facilities. We handed them a voluminous number of documents and for them to pre-review so that they could prep themselves for their review. Okay, I've talked about them. Let's talk about who they are. Okay, so the CSSG is a 10-person member group formed by NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and it's comprised of both federal and contractor criticality safety subject matter experts. They work under the program, the Nuclear Criticality Safety Program sponsored by the Department of Energy. Their origin was from a Defense Board recommendation. Back in that recommendation, the Defense Board identified that, that DOE needed to reinvigorate their effort to establish a core group of criticality subject matter experts that could be a resource for the complex to assist all entities in performing their missions. And so that group was formed. In their charter, their scope includes contractor nuclear criticality safety programs, to review contractor nuclear criticality safety programs. They have their own charter, their own work instructions, and their own membership policy. It's a 10-member team. 5 of those members came down to the Savannah River site and performed that review. Okay, they came down, they spent a couple of weeks with us. It was, I believe it was in January, it was right after Christmas, so January timeframe of this year. They came down and they kind of assessed all of our facilities. They did the same things I talked about in the other assessments. They looked at paper, they looked at issued documents, they interviewed operators, support staff, criticality safety engineers. They watched our work processes of how the criticality safety engineers interface with the operators, how the criticality safety engineers do their analyses, and how they work with amongst themselves and interface with the other groups, other parts of engineering and whatnot. And they assessed all those things, and ultimately their conclusions were that, right out of their report, overall, the criticality safety program was found to be healthy and functioning well. The issues that led to the consent order were evaluated, understood, and corrective actions have been developed and in some cases completed, which precludes similar events from occurring. They identified no findings. We thought that was pretty surprising when you had such 5 highly experienced personnel in the DOE complex and in program space come and look, but they identified no findings. They did identify a number of areas for improvement. They captured those in approximately, 9 recommendations. And again, they focused a lot on the performance of the criticality safety engineer function, about ways to improve how they can perform, how the management team can do better in the area of oversight, improve the way we look at metrics and trending, and how we can use more leading indicators to identify areas where we have problems. And again, some recommendations in the self-assessment process as well. But again, no findings and a very thorough scrub from those folks. So again, in summary, we had our consent order that occurred back in 2016. We had the key actions for those to perform those independent reviews, of which we added our own internal reviews. So we did 2 independent assessments and 1 internal assessment ourselves. All that was done. All that information was shared with the Office of Enforcement and our local DOESR. Those reviews concluded that the program was found to be healthy and functioning well in compliance with requirements. And we provided closure documentation to the Office of Enforcement. And again, here in August, we did get notification that they consider the matter closed. In the process of doing this, I'd like to say that we did pick up a number of opportunities for improvement from these 3 reviews. And I mentioned that we consider ourselves a learning organization. My department, I think to a person, if you ask any of them, our goal is to, if we're not doing it right, we'd like to be told, and we'll correct that and fix it. We don't want an event or an issue to manifest as a method of finding out that we have either an error in our process or an omission in our process. And so we do take these reviews seriously, and we take even the opportunities for improvement seriously, to move ourselves up and have our program function even better. Our company's philosophy is that we're a learning organization to strive to ensure compliance with requirements and achieve a vision of being the standard of excellence in nuclear materials management. Myself and the group I represent contributes to that by trying to get our criticality safety program to be an excellent program. And again, and we'll take these opportunities for improvement that are identified in these reviews to make changes, to make positive changes to further improve our performance. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Mary, you were first one up. Let's start with you. It's okay.
Put it back down. Mary Weber Cab, thank you, Mr. Martini, for your presentation. We've been waiting to hear about the results of the consent order for a while, those of us who've been on the board for a few years. And I know that there are a number of board members here today who are new this year, and they may not really know the circumstances that went into the operational pause. And I wondered if you could give them some factual context for what you're presenting, because some of them may be familiar with what led to the consent order, and some of them may not. And then for me, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the no findings were identified during the review. I don't understand what no findings means.
Sure.
So those are my two issues.
Okay.
Thank you.
For your first question, back in 2015, again, dealing with the Office of Enforcement, we're dealing with the nuclear safety section of the Office of Enforcement. So we had two events. We experienced two events in 2015 that had impacts in our complying with nuclear safety requirements. There was an event that occurred in the January-February timeframe where the HB line facility lost power, and in restoring power to the facility, we didn't recognize that one of our pieces of equipment did not have the power restored. It was an agitator, and the agitator was used to stir nuclear material in a vessel, and later we would take samples from that vessel, and by not having the agitator running, the sample we took and the sample results were not accurate, and that resulted in us not having, our requirement was to have accurate sample results, and that ended up being a procedural, a control violation in how we did our nuclear safety analysis for that operation. Later in the year, we had an event where operators were packaging nuclear material, and we had a procedural requirement to put it in this type of a container, and the operators packaged the material in a different container in violation of the procedure. So that was another violation of a control that we had in a procedure. And that event kind of caused our president at the time, it was Carol Johnson, to kind of look at, hey, what are our people doing? We need to stop and evaluate our operations, because this is not behavior that we condone or expect, and we don't understand why that happened. So we stopped to do that issue investigation, kind of a mindset to understand what happened and make sure we put processes in place to ensure that it didn't continue in the future. And that's kind of what the operational pause was about, our safety pause. Your second question on the what does it mean to have no findings? In assessment space, when there is, we assess to requirements, okay? And so when we look, we view things very black and white. Are we complying with the requirements or not? It's a very black and white kind of test. So to say there are no findings means that an assessor looked and evaluated work against criteria and saw at no time was the work not in compliance with the criteria. Or to say it the other way, the work was found to be compliant with the work documents and criteria. And they found no instances where we did not do our work in accordance with our procedures and program.
Thank you. So the no findings related to contemporary work, not the work that gave rise to the shutdown.
Yes, ma'am. Since
Okay.
then, They did look back over, the document query they asked for was over about a 2-year period, so it kind of was just after the pause events.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, sir.
Mayor, I'd like to make a question. So, just so I'm clear, so the 2-year, so the container situation over the long weekend, was that reviewed? That
I mean-
specific thing was reviewed, or it was all post that?
From that event, we entered into a series of changes and corrective actions. They did look at the subsequent documents that were changed from that. The documents in the revision that occurred on the day of the event, those documents were not in that, those documents were no longer valid documents
Okay.
at the time they came.
And do we have a cost on all of this, that all generating this was?
Well, the Criticality Safety Support Group is actually sponsored by NNSA and is of no cost to any contractor. So with DOE's SRS help to invite them to the site, they came at a free cost to, say, SRNS. Of course, we did expend level of effort for our own staff on our internal review, and we did, I don't have a dollar figure, but we did hire the 2 gentlemen to do the effectiveness review.
So it didn't come out of NSA, did it come out of EM?
Mike Mcleod, DOE. Gil, I'll have to get back to you on how that's funded. I don't know how the CSSG, when they do a trip, whether it's, I'm not sure how the participants on that group are compensated for travel or their hours. We'll look that up and get back to you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate Mary asking the questions because there were a lot of people here not on the board, and it was a pretty hot topic in 2015 for it. And so the train just went by. But I appreciate the work you did, and that's all I have to say about that as far as compensation.
Thank you.
Dave Isley, CAB. Bob, thanks for a thorough briefing. The first independent review, who did that?
There were 2 gentlemen, one Mr. Rick Boylston and Mr. Dan Beavers. I forget the name of the companies they were represented by, but both of them were subcontracted in.
Wismas?
No, Wismas doesn't exist. Mr. Boylston was formerly of AECom
Right.
or URS. He did have a long tenure here at the Savannah River site, and Mr. Beavers did as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other follow-up, folks? No? You're getting off a lot easier than I thought you would. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So up next we have, oh gosh, Bill Barnes. I keep blanking on his last name. Bill Barnes is coming up. He's going to give a presentation on 3H Evaporator. This is another long-running project that's been going on. Narinder asked a few questions about it yesterday. So this will be another follow-up, giving you an idea of where things sit now and how the project's running. All right, ready, Bill? There we go. Middle button. That's why she got back up and go. Which part did you want? Sorry, got to center up.
Okay, good afternoon. Pleased to be here. Bill Barnes, Savannah River Remediation. Purpose of today's briefing is to bring you up to speed on, as was mentioned, the 3H evaporator. Now I'm going to go through a little more background than I normally would because, as has been mentioned, there's a number of newer cab members. But I have a really good story to tell today, and So I'm excited to do so. Just a little background. The 3H evaporator is the largest evaporator we have on site. It began operations in the year 2000. It's about 3 times larger than any other evaporator we have or ever used. It's therefore very essential, and I'll go through that several times, essential in evaporating off liquids so that we can access salt and sludge and empty waste out of the underground storage tanks that contain 36 million gallons, which is our biggest environmental hazard. Originally, pot leak was discovered in February 2006. Just to give you an idea of size, it's about 27 feet high, about 14 feet in diameter, holds about 10,000 gallons working space. Unlike a lot of other evaporators or containers, containment devices out there, it sits in its own building, fully enclosed building with a stainless steel lined secondary containment. It has a cell sump. Were there to be any condensate or any type of liquid waste, we have the ability to pump it to a waste tank. And the evaporator itself is about 40 foot deep. Just another picture. This is the original evaporator that's still installed without its insulation. We put about 2 inches of insulation on with stainless steel lagging around it. Here it is sitting in the cell. And again, it's enclosed within a building. Okay, a little history. February 2016, we shut it down. Salt was seen leaking out. We did extensive testing. We utilized robots. I briefed on that before. Went down, cut off the insulation and lagging. We used state-of-the-art ultrasonic testing to find out where the thin spot was. Turned out to be erosion at the very bottom cone of the evaporator. So we pinpointed that large leak site in February 2017. Again, it was large, about 150,000 gallons a day, and about 3,000 gallons had leaked into the secondary containment. Again, this is a very robust system. Nothing made it through the environment. It worked as designed. This is a picture taken during the removal of that lagging and insulation so that we could see the actual vessel wall. So I'm going to go back. You see the working space? So we had developed robots to fit down in there 40 feet, operated from a control room about 100 foot away, and perform that investigative work. Okay, so we've identified at this point the leak site. The left-hand corner, that's the lagging and insulation removed. You see at the very bottom of the evaporator pot, a significant spray. What we did then is we developed and deployed some additional robotics to repair that leak. This is a picture of a different robot down in the cell. We had designed a cap that would essentially fit on the bottom of that cone, and used a robot to weld that cone or that cap to the bottom of the cone. That worked. That fixed that leak. That no leakage from there. But when we started up, we noticed some anomalies. Now we have the insulation off, unrelated to the repair. Now we can see the vessel wall where previously it had been covered up with insulation and lagging. Did we get the video working or? Okay, this would be a video if it worked. And what it would do is just show you some of this really interesting equipment that was deployed. Are we locked? Okay, so I mentioned we've got the insulation off. We noticed 2 weep sites, about 3 feet and 5 feet above the repair cap. Very small deposits of salt. Here are the pictures, 1 area and 2 areas. And again, we had no leakage down at the repair site. So instead of rushing into, okay, it's time to go repair this evaporator, and there's a huge impact to that. 2-year hit to the system plan, which essentially extends the time waste is sitting in those underground carbon steel storage tanks. So we took a hard look at it, got a lot of experts involved, and what they found were the leaks, these salt nodules, were at welds. They were much smaller. Instead of 150 gallons a day, they were less than half a liter a day, calculated to be about 3 mils or the size of a human hair. It was dry material. As that salt weeps and hits air, it solidifies like we've seen in some of our waste tanks. They went through all the possible causes and found that, and looked at original manufacturer fabrication details and determined that the most likely cause were weld defects during the original manufacture 22 years ago, covered up with insulation. The leak sites, when they looked at the forces, thermal stresses, mechanical stresses, determined they're too small. They will not grow. There's insufficient energy to do that, and that the vessel is still structurally sound. So with that, we said, okay, let's look at options. So like we do a lot at the site, we used a formal process, a systems engineering evaluation, where we looked at 19 different options, looking at impacts on getting waste out of the tanks, processing salt and sludge, emptying the tanks, safety basis, operability and dose is a big one, cost and schedule. Came up with 4 leading candidates. Continue with some enhanced controls, repair it, replace it, or a major project, find a way, a new path for DWPF recycle to go instead of going back to the tank farm. The recommended option was to operate with enhanced surveillance. It was determined it could be done safely, and there was minimal risk, is minimal risk when compared to the extended storage of waste in the underground tanks, which are aging every day. Significant personal radiological exposure would be encountered for either repair or replace options. That's certainly something we take very seriously. Either option of repairing or replacing would require us to run 3H as it is. Reason being, with what we found with the original defects, we would want to run it longer for some period of time to see if there's any additional weeping, or else we'd be chasing perhaps defects, which with robots, which is very manpower intensive, and again, the dose rate. For replacement, the tank farm was so full, we would need to run the evaporator just to make space, about 300,000 gallons, to decontaminate that evaporator so we could take it out. Additionally, cost or time. Let's talk time. The repair option, about a year. Replace, about 2 years. And that, when you look at the impact on the overall system plan, it's huge as far as when we can get those tanks emptied. Because without this evaporator, until it became functional, we could not make the next sludge batch. There was not enough room in the system. Without the next sludge batch, downstream facilities like DWPF, SWPF, Saltstone all come to a halt until we have made a sludge batch to keep the whole system running. And then there's, again, by putting in some controls that ensures we can operate safe with these minor weep sites, we can quickly minimize that impact on the system plan. Okay, why is 3H important? I mentioned it a little bit. I want to reinforce it because it is worth doing so. The primary mission is to support sludge batch preparation. Each sludge batch takes about 1 million gallons of water to wash, and this vessel gives us the capacity to quickly evaporate that off. It allows for sludge batch 10 preparation and allows for waste removal activities to continue, which is true waste reduction. Supports sustained MCU and SWPF operation and progress, as I mentioned, toward emptying these tanks until more permanent options perhaps can get readied. And again, I'm going to reinforce the fact it balances the minimal risk posed by small and well-controlled leak releases, weeping of salt into the evaporator cell versus the potential risk of extended storage of waste in our 1 million gallon tanks that are in the ground. So why is it low risk? It's a very robust system. Unlike previous evaporators, it's fully enclosed with a building to prevent contamination events during cell entries and to minimize impacts of the weather. It sits within a concrete cell that's fully lined with stainless steel to ensure containment and to facilitate decontamination. This secondary containment holds 30,000 gallons. We operate this evaporator with 10,000 gallons. This cell contains a sump, which has dip tube level indication, conductivity probe for liquid detection. Additionally, under the secondary containment, we have an underliner sump with an additional conductivity probe. This system has cell ventilation, includes HEPA filtration, which is continuously monitored for airborne, and area radiation monitors would detect any increased radiation rates. So the results, we've implemented controls through our documented safety analysis and our facility controls to safely operate the evaporator. We've resumed 3H evaporator operation. One of the controls is periodic cell inspections. Some of our scientists who analyze this from SRNL and other entities estimated a leak rate of about half a liter, again, a day at most. Their predictions were excellent. What we're seeing is much less than that. Since startup, we've got about 1 to 2 gallons of leakage of weepage of salt. Our safety analysis says we're completely safe up to 1,000 gallons, and at much less, maybe perhaps 500 gallons, 700 gallons, we would wash down the cell, jet it to a tank. So this is a picture right before we restarted, picture about a month later. Since we restarted, we've made space gains of over 300,000 gallons. That has enabled us to continue progress towards sludge batch 10, which enables us to continue progress toward emptying tanks and getting ready for sludge or salt, downstream salt processing facilities. So sludge batch 10, again, back on track. We're getting excellent results. The evaporator is working very well, steady operations, weep rates as expected, and we continue to look at it shiftly. So in summary, the original leak at the very bottom cone, which was caused by a lance that is used to mix up what's in the bottom of the pot. That lance eroded caused the loss of metal at the bottom. That's what we repaired. These two unrelated weep sites on the cone have been evaluated and controls have been put in place to safely operate. Again, this is all about balancing minimal risk posed by small and well-controlled releases of waste into the evaporator cell compared to the potential risks we all know about posed by extended time waste is stored in aging underground storage tanks. If for some reason, and based on what we've seen, this is the last thing we would expect, but if that leak rate increased beyond the evaluated levels, we would shut it down. We have a spare pot, 3H pot, procurement in progress as a contingency. We may or may not use it, but the cost for replacement of the pot, the actual pot itself is just a fraction of that cost. The majority of the cost to replace a pot by far is decontamination, cutting out the existing evaporator, disposing of it, lots of dose. And that's something that does not look like we will need to do. So that's the good news story. Waste removal activities continue at the site at a good pace. And so it's been a long ride getting here, but the team's done a good job, used a lot of innovative technology and really a lot of good scientific evaluation. Any questions?
So let's start with Don.
Dawn Gillis Cab. Thank you for the presentation. That was very thorough. In fact, every time I was going, I'm going to oh, he just answered that question. But I still have one. In order to continue looking at, to evaluate your current leaks, you're not putting the insulation and the sheeting back on it, correct?
That is correct.
And does that affect the performance of the evaporator by not putting that insulation back on it?
It does not. The insulation removed is at the very bottom section where it really tapers down. So one of the things we had to do is calculate how that affected the whole system, and found that we did not need to insulate, put insulation back on. Ventilation systems, the evaporator performance itself, we haven't seen a difference.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Doug, I think yours was next.
Doug Howard Cap. Great presentation. The two minimal leaks that you had after that major leak, do you have any idea, were they there before that major leak, or you just discovered them once you had put it back online after the major leakage there at the bottom?
Right. That is the predominant theory by the scientists, that those two small weep sites have been there since the evaporator was put in service 20 odd years ago. It was covered with this insulation and sheathing. We came in with robots because we saw this larger leak, cut the insulation and sheathing off. When we restarted the evaporator, that's when these little sites became apparent. In fact, one of the two has gone away. It's salted out. We can't see it.
Okay, and last question. Do you have any idea how long you think this will, the evaporator will go to distance?
Personal opinion, the evaporator will last the life of the mission.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jim Giel, Cab. Newbie, so I have a silly kind of question. Where does all the wash water that's evaporated go?
Right. So the water's boiled off, condensed, treated, and sent to the effluent treatment facility, where it's further treated to where it can be released to the environment.
Okay. All right.
Very,
thank you.
very, very low dose activity that's easily treatable.
All right. Let's go all the way down to the end. Susan?
Susan Corbett, Cab. So I was just trying to look up here where this company, Hastelloy, I see they make a lot of things like this. This is an American company.
It is a type of metal. It's an alloy that different companies can make. You've got stainless steel, you've got Hastelloy, you've got, a number of different types of metal.
So who is the company that manufactured this particular model?
The evaporator itself,
Yes.
Joseph Oat.
I'm sorry?
Joseph Oat.
Oat? Oh,
Yes.
You know what? I remember this now. Okay, and I see that it was originally supposed to last for 30 years.
That is correct.
And it really only lasted half of that time. Is there some kind of a warranty that you get when you buy these things? I mean, it didn't meet the life expectancy here. It started leaking halfway through its life. They don't come in and say offer to replace it if it doesn't live up to its function?
No.
No. You guys get a better guarantee next time. So my understanding is that if this thing isn't working, a whole bunch of other things close down.
That is correct.
So this would be what you kind of call in engineering terms a single point of vulnerability?
It is you could call it that. It is a key to keep, you've probably seen the gear chart, right? It is key to keeping waste removal activities occurring in the tank farm, which feeds the downstream facilities I mentioned, like SWPF and DWPF. So that is the reason we decided as a contingency to buy a spare pot.
Are you buying the second one from the same company?
We are. Now, let me tell you what we've done. We have, this company does a lot of work, nuclear work in a lot of places. We brought to them the lessons learned or our findings. We hired outside consultants who are experts in welding to review the original specification as well as SRNL. They came up with a list of improvements on how to not have it happen again. We did a change order, incorporated all those improvements, which included not just how you weld it, welding gas mixtures, but quality inspections, quality oversight, that type of thing.
Well, I'm curious just as to why, obviously, a sophisticated piece of equipment like this would fail at the seams. I mean, was it the wells basically didn't hold, is what you're kind of saying? Is that true? And then what activity would cause that? Is it the material that it was used in the weld itself that was degraded from what's going on here, or do you have some knowledge about that? Why this happened?
It wasn't the material. The material is well suited for this very harsh environment. What the experts presumed and concluded is that one of the weep sites, these are both related to the welding technique itself. One of the weep sites, the smaller one, porosity. So when welders weld, one of the things to get it right, you don't have any interconnected porosity. The other one was attributed to lack of fusion. So again, that's welding technique, which our quality services, quality inspectors, qualified weld inspectors, looking at radiography, that type of thing, should be able to pick up.
So they should have been able to, if those were not done correctly, they should have been able to pick up on that?
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, we've tightened up. Instead of the vendor looking at 100% of their welds, and our quality folks looking at some percentage of those weld records, we're now looking at, we've identified all the difficult welds, and there's quite much more quality oversight.
Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Joyce?
Joyce Underwood Cab. Hopefully these are easier questions. You said that if there's too much of the sediment on the outside of the machine that you would wash it down and send it back to a tank. Is that correct?
That is correct.
does that further exacerbate your tank problem?
Oh, no, it doesn't. What we're talking about is very small quantities of salt. It compared to the amount of waste we have, this is
Drop in the
a drop
bucket?
in the bucket. Thank you.
So the leak previously, the 150 gallons a day, is that what happened to everything that came out? It went back into a tank?
That's correct.
Okay. And one last question unrelated to that. So this stuff is accumulating on the outside of this machine, but it's inside this secure facility, correct?
That is
So in the sweet by and by, in the fullness of time, whenever the site is decommissioned, is that going to be a problem when that time comes to have to decommission that machine?
No.
No.
We would do, one of two things. We would decontaminate it and dispose of it, or, just thought that pops into my mind, I'm not saying I've talked to anybody about this, or we would grout it in place, like once we've gotten down, gotten all the waste out.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Narendra Cab. Bill, thank you very much for making a second presentation in a very short time. Last time we talked about the small leaks. I thought the salts will take care of that. Are they still?
You mean, make sure I understand your question. Your question is that the weep sites would actually salt up.
Yeah.
Yes. And that is what's happening. Now, there is a small amount of moisture, but we have no liquid that has hit the bottom of the cell and ran to the sump. It's salt. So we do have some crumbles of salt underneath the evaporator. So certainly the fact that it salts up, as you know, slows down any weep rate.
Another question is, just for general knowledge, what caused the erosion? Have we taken any precautions to stop erosion in the future?
Excellent question. The original site that we fixed, the large site at the very bottom of the cone that we put the cap on, again, we used robots, did ultrasonic testing to get wall thickness. We narrowed it down. We had good wall thickness all the way up the evaporator, except for that bottom cone. So we narrowed it down to erosion. We have a steam lance that points, that's right in that area. That matches right with where the loss of metal at the bottom was. In looking at it, in going back and looking at the steam rates, we determined the original steam rates applied that have been operating for 16 years, more than needed, okay? So too much velocity. So what you have at the bottom is crud, right? And if you spray steam or water against sand or crud, you're going to erode. So what we did is after calculation, we cut down the steam flow by 1/3, and I don't have the exact numbers, but the calculations are that the erosion seen in 16 years by the change in steam flow, that erosion would now take over 100 years.
Wow. Another question. Could it be that insulation might have been causing a problem? Because the condensation and minor leaks could have degraded the metal of the pot?
We don't believe so.
Okay.
Anyone else? Thank you, Bill. Okay, if you remember, we originally had a break scheduled for the end of that presentation, but we're gonna hold off because we moved our public comment and our voting up. So let's go ahead and power through that, and we'll get to a break. First up is the public comment, and normally what we do is we take everybody signed up and we divide the time available. We only have one person signed up currently, Suzanne Rhodes. If you'll come up, we'll give you a few minutes to talk and then see if anybody else has any public comments. Tom is also wanting to talk, so we'll get him next.
Okay, thank you very much. I haven't been to a CAB meeting in quite a while, but I've been concerned about this issue for 45 years, I guess. The league has been I'm Suzanne Rhodes with the South Carolina League of Women Voters. We're a nonprofit volunteer civic group. Even our lobbyist, Lynn Teague, who sometimes makes the papers, is a volunteer. I wrote a thesis about this, I think 45 years ago, and got other jobs. And when I retired about 10 years ago, I got back to this. And I'm glad to see some of the same people and some new ones here since last time I was here. The League of Women Voters is policy-oriented. We never endorse a candidate. And our policies are mostly with ethics in the State House and public education. They're more than that. But our SRS concerns are those darn tanks and stabilizing the wastes that are here and probably going to stay forever unless somebody volunteers. And also that the wastes that are here are as safe as possible, and I know that takes a lot of money. And one of the problems with the tanks is that the delegation hasn't given us the money. I'm going to ask Shelley, or if somebody else knows, not now, how to affect the legislature, our delegation, in a timely fashion, because they just are not doing right. They like the flashy, bangy stuff, but not the cleanup. And if they cut back the schedule some more, that means tanks are going to be here longer, and they're already older than almost everybody in the room except me. At any rate, yesterday there were two things that concerned me. One of them was brought up was the lack of information about Savannah River site, which I think is a really important concern. And there is very little information about the site. Especially, I think the local newspapers want all the good news, and you all get it. But I want to thank SRS, I guess their PR office, for including the SRS clips, which you should be getting. And you'll find out some good stuff in there that you won't find in the paper. Well, they're usually from another paper, not the really local ones. And so if you really want to know about information, I strongly suggest you look at Tom Clement's websites and Facebook sites. He has all the bad news. It's pretty depressing sometimes, but that's where I first read that the MOX plant was bad. It was a design for another concept, not carefully reworked. That's where I first heard about the pits, which I'll talk about now, because the reputation of the SRS site used to be bomb plant, and then it was silent. And cleanup started maybe 30 years ago, and the states of Georgia and South Carolina got involved, and Shelley was not long after that. And then there's a little bit more community involvement since then. But if you look at Tom's site, you'll notice that some yahoo somewhere thinks this world needs more bombs. We already have 15,000 of them. U.S. has about half. Russia has a tad more than we do, but only a tad. The other countries have 300. Korea has a handful who are all excited. Pakistan and India could just about do out the world if they get mad enough at each other. So we really need to look at whether or not we want more bombs. The whole purpose is to reuse that shell of a MOX plant. Anyway, I'm concerned more bombs like that make more waste, which means more tank problems. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Great. And Tom, you also had a comment?
Yeah, Tom Clements, Savannah River Site Watch. That's srswatch.org if you want to get some more news that you won't read in the local papers about the Savannah River Site, DOE, and nuclear nonproliferation issues. Just to follow up on what Susan said about reuse of the MOX plant, obviously NNSA has proposed production of pits for nuclear weapons, which will produce waste streams. And I haven't seen any analysis of that, which is to my point. DOE is going to have to do an environmental impact statement on converting that facility once the MOX program is officially terminated. So you may have a role there if they want to transfer those waste streams to environmental management. It's unclear to me now what would happen to them. DOE has said, some people in DOE said there would be no waste streams, which is not accurate. But keep your eyes open for any EIS that might be done. As I think I mentioned yesterday, the MOX program was funded to $340 million this year. October 1st, it goes down to $220. It's basically enough just to keep the lights on. DOE still has the ability to waiver spending money on construction. So the repurposing, as it's called, of the MOX facility may be at hand. What I really wanted to make a comment about was on the German spent fuel issue. Some of you who hadn't been on the cab a long time don't know that it was 5 years ago that Savannah River Site Watch revealed that certain entities were looking into importing this graphite spent fuel from Germany. It took DOE a while to publicly reveal that that was the case. I know you can't see this, and I didn't bring the big pictures, but there's about 450 large casks full of these graphite balls, which is in a very stable form. We heard that addressed during the Savannah River National Lab presentation, and I was quite concerned to hear the director say Germans have been using graphite reactors for a number of years for research purposes. That statement is very misleading. They're looking at fuel from 2 reactors that stopped operating in 1988 and 1989. They were not research reactors, they were experimental power reactors that were hooked to the grid. His implication, as I heard it, was that the Germans are still doing this. It's not the case. It was always the plan to dispose of that material in Germany. But since that environmental assessment was finished, now some people are revealing that really there's bigger design behind this. They want to develop a new reprocessing technique to process materials potentially from other facilities or to apply it at other facilities, which could mean more waste coming to Savannah River Site. As I said yesterday, it's illegal under German law to export commercial spent fuel. There's already been notification to German authorities and the European Union that there will be legal action if they move to the point of export. But as he said during the Savannah River National Lab presentation, the Germans are paying for this, so it's money driven. It's in a secure, stable form. It should stay in that form. He said that they want to identify ways to dispose of the graphite fuel without generating much liquid waste. There is no liquid waste now. It's in a graphite form for disposal. So I appreciate your passing the statement last year not to import this material. Excuse me, it's still on the table about what the options might be in Germany, but I still, as I've said many times before, that there will be legal action if it comes to the point where they actually move to attempt any kind of export to Savannah River Site for processing and dumping in the tanks here, which we don't need more waste coming in. Thank you.
We have another minute or two left. Chuck, briefly, please.
Yes, I'll make it brief. Chuck Messick, and I've been here a couple of times regarding the German project. But one quick thing on the pollinator, which I really think is a good effort to do, is the organizations that sometimes plant things along the interstates. It's not part of the actual highway department. They may be another good organization that might be willing to support an effort on site. But just a suggestion there. And regarding the German graphite fuel, as I mentioned before, I've sort of worked on this project when I was with NNSA, basically consulting with EM a little bit on this project. And I still believe it's a good project, and it's a sort of a win-win situation. If the Germans can't ship it because of the law, and that happens to be the law over there, if that's true, then that's no skin off our back from that perspective. We still are getting the technology development that we as the United States needs with some of the other materials in the country. The technology development is again a win-win situation for us. And a little bit, if I could just read one statement out of the The FONSI, finding of no significant impact, that was put out in December 2017. Repatriating the spent nuclear fuel containing U.S. origin HEU from Germany supports the U.S. policy objective to reduce and eventually eliminate HEU in civil commerce, and it's consistent with the U.S. non-proliferation policy. This material at some point in time does need to be disposed of. Disposed of something in a HEU form, highly enriched uranium form, is not in my opinion, a good disposition option for that. It needs to be processed and gotten rid of so that it can never be used as in a weapon format. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, CAB members, if you'll look underneath your nameplate, you will find your voting clickers. We have some voting that we need to do today. It's like a fun little Easter egg of activity. All right, so first thing up is going to be the chair's rec. Gil, if you want to run this vote, please.
Do we want to do the recommendations for closure first?
Oh, yeah, the closure ones. Yes, let's do that one. Sorry.
Good afternoon. We're going to close some things. I'm going to ask the committee chairs for these to lead them off for the closures. Larry, if you could talk about the reclassification of high-level waste. That's your recommendation?
Dawn. It's Dawn's.
I apologize, Dawn.
That's me.
I apologize. I apologize. Forgive me. Dawn, can you give us a little bit of information on that?
Dawn Gillis Cab, yeah, we talked about it a little bit yesterday. It was trying to deal with some of the current high-level waste canisters to redefine them based on risk versus origin, and it's a more or less a law. I guess it's a law change, right, or is it a rule change? But it's not something that the site has direct control of, but they do have input into. So that was our recommendation, was for them to go put their input in, and they said they would do that and keep us apprised of any activities related to that. So
Great. And the Waste Management Committee
recommends to close it.
Okay. Can I have a motion to close recommendation 354?
I guess I can't really.
Narinder? You make the motion? Yeah. Who was the second? Me. Joyce? Okay. All those in favor of closing recommendation 354, please press 1A or green. All those opposed, press 2B or red. Okay, can we close the voting? And it has been passed. Thank you. Moving on to recommendation 355, budget, pension, and scope. I know this is Tom French. Yours? He's not looking. He looked at me funny. Tom, can you give us a little synopsis?
Yeah, so we talked about this also yesterday. We missed you being here, Gil.
Thank you.
And the original mission for this committee, this temporary committee, was to outline things we wanted the department to do to help bring spotlight to the pension issue and to address some public information issues about the pension. They've agreed to do all the things we've asked. We're starting to see attention. The budget has been up for 2019. We're going to cover 2019 pension. So we recommend to close it.
All right. Do I have a motion to close this? Tom French moves to close it. Do I have a second? Second. Larry Powell is the second. All those in favor of closing this recommendation, please press the green button. All those opposed, please press the red button. Voting is closed. All right, it is closed. Tom and your committee, I do really thank you for the work you put in. Put a lot of work in there in a short period of time to come up with a recommendation, and thank you for everything that you did. Thank you very much. Moving on to chair recommendations, public engagement. This is a recommendation that came out of the Environmental Site-Specific Advisory Board at the meeting that Doug and I attended just a few weeks ago. Did we read it in yesterday? Okay, we don't need to read it in again? No? No. Thank you, I appreciate that. Is there any, do I have a motion to, we can't change anything, so do I have a motion to accept it?
ask a question real quick? Did you figure out what was going on with that strange semicolon in the middle of that sentence?
No, that's something that's going to be figured out by headquarters.
Yeah, we can't do a thing about it.
I motion to.
Motion by Narinder to accept it. Second by Joyce Underwood. All right, any discussion on this beyond a semicolon? All right, all those approving, press the green button, or yay. All those saying no, press the red button.
There you go.
Okay, voting is closed. And we passed it. We will, James and his team and Lisa will forward this on, letting that board know that Savannah Riverside approved it. Moving on to the draft recommendations.
The pollinator management program is going to go back to committee, so. It's
Which one?
The first one that's listed?
The pollinator management program?
Yep.
It's
that
going
one.
back to committee?
Yep, so it's the one afterwards.
So we are taking that off the agenda. We don't need
Yes.
to table it or anything? Okay. So Dan, before we get a motion, if you'd like to say a few words on your recommendation?
Sure. Dan Kaminsky, CAB. This recommendation is just to take a look at alternate cap methods and plantings that could supplement the current grass. And then also the third recommendation was to also consider putting the surrounding areas of those landfills with indigenous plants and pollinator.
Okay. Thank you. Do we need to read this into, or is it read in yesterday?
No, read in yesterday.
I like that. All right, can I get a motion to accept recommendation number 3, what is it?
We'll number it after it's approved.
I'm sorry, the recommendation plant indigenous flowering plants on industrial landfills. Do I have a motion? Tom French, and then I heard a second. Don Gillis? And a third, yes, don't need that. If you are for this recommendation, if you're going to vote yay, please press green. If you're nay, please press red. And we have all voted. Voting is closed. And the recommendation goes forward. Thank you very much. James, back to you.
All right, folks, it's 1:52. Let's come back from a break at 2:05, 2:10? 2:10?
2:10.
Okay, 2:10. 13, 14. Okay, that's good. We can start. So, those of you who are fortunate enough to be on the tour have already met Mr. Bender. He gave us a good overview of some of the infrastructure challenges that they're facing on the site, and here he's going to go a bit more in depth for everyone else who wasn't able to make it. So, really hope you enjoy this one. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. Dave?
Thank you, James. Good afternoon. I'm Dave Bender, and I work in the office of, the AM for Infrastructure and Environmental Stewardship, and it is my great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. Oh, gotta turn it on. Thank you. There we go. And I'm here to, at the request, to talk about infrastructure, but not just any infrastructure. I'm here to talk about common infrastructure. And just a brief definition, infrastructure is any physical structure supporting equipment that's there to fulfill a purpose or mission. And common infrastructure, which is I'm going to specifically talk about today at Savannah River site, is that infrastructure that supports two or more tenants, missions, or programs. So let's start off with Common Infrastructure 101. Now, Bill just gave us a great discussion over a piece of mission-specific infrastructure, program infrastructure, so to speak, with the H area evaporator. And as an example that I have on my slide, of course, is H Canyon. You hear a lot about here in the cab. I'm getting a lot of discussions and talks about things like DWP, infrastructure like DWPF, K area, SWPF, for instance. But what I'm going to center on today is something maybe hasn't been discussed very often, and that's the common infrastructure. And there are three basic types of common infrastructure that I'm really talking about here today. One that you probably think of more often is just facilities, roads and grounds, parking areas, for instance. That's what I would call our basic common infrastructure. But there's also common infrastructure that supports the site, and that's in the utility realm. We have water, just like your house, like any city does. Of course, we need sanitary sewers. We also have electricity coming in. And we also have, unique to an industrial type site, of course, we have steam as well. In order to make this city or installation called Savannah River Site work, we also have a number of services that, just like any other city or industrial site, that require communications, for instance. You need services to provide your internet. So we have IT, we have shops that provide calibration services to all the different tenants, stakeholders, and programs that are on Savannah River Site. And this is just a quick cartoon to give you an idea of how varied and how large Savannah River Site really is. We have like 64 miles of high voltage transmission lines and substations that help support the site. We have two what we call high hazard dams, and they're called high hazard not because they're at risk, but simply because that should they fail, their impact would be sorely felt. So that's the reason why they're termed high hazard. We have typical water that you find in any other city. I talked about our common facilities. We have a couple chilled water plants that help provide environmental cooling in many of our administrative buildings, and also to SRNL, the lab. Don't know if you realize it, one way to put it is that just the entire land area of the site is larger than the beltway that encompasses DC. We also have 3 locomotives and 33 miles of track. We also have lower voltage electrical distribution, a lot of it, almost 200 miles. We got plenty of paved road. And I mentioned earlier steam. And one system that's, I would say, unique, kind of a legacy system, that's our river water system. That river water system was essential back when we had the 5 heavy water reactors running. Essential for cooling. And that's a good example of something I'll talk about later of how we right-size that system down to something that we could still use. And this slide, just to let you know, I'm sure those of you who have worked out at Savannah Riverside or toured the site, nearly 50% of our infrastructure is over 30 years old. So like a house, municipal buildings downtown, after 30 years, you need to start replacing a few things or replacing the entire facility altogether. Here's just 4 of the tools that we use when it comes to assessing infrastructure. Up there in the left-hand corner, it's called FIMS. It's a Facility Information Management System. And I'm not going to say that's the system that DOE has adopted to harness and to contain and to all the information about all the real property and infrastructure on the site. And we're not quite there yet of getting the correct information in there, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But another tool that we use is our real property 5-year plan. The site produces that. And what that's used for is it's more unconstrained, or it's not resource constrained, so to speak. So it's kind of a big picture of where we would like to go. One of the devices or the tools that I use for the common infrastructure is that we have the system health report that each engineer in charge of our different systems, whether it be electric, roads and grounds, even facilities, chill water, each produce every month. They update what the health of that system happens to be. So we look at that a lot. And then finally, at the site level, we have this thing called the Master Infrastructure List that combines everything, not just common infrastructure, but also our program and mission type infrastructure as well. But at the common infrastructure level, this is what I'm really here to talk about. This is how we do common infrastructure planning and execution. Simple slide, I think pretty commonsensical. We put together a 5-year plan. But the key thing about this 5-year plan, we make assumptions on what resources, how many people, how many dollars we're going to get each year out in 5 years. So that when we put together a plan, we have a pretty good idea we believe we're going to execute it. And we also list out those things we need to do that maybe aren't going to be resourced, at least as part of our assumptions. So we have those in our crosshairs in case something changes for the better, so that we can execute those if money, people come available. Then based on that 5-year plan, which by the way is done in December, so that captures us into our budget cycle. At the end of the year, our site services folks works with SRS. They produce the 1-year plan. Now this is more detail on what they're going to execute in terms of common infrastructure improvements during that year. So that becomes our guide map for what we're going to do for improvements. And then finally, we grade SRNS, site services, on how well they executed that year's plan. They have to produce a document. We send DOE people out to inspect each of their projects, write a document on it. We make a star assessment on it. And all these 3 plans and how we grade the execution plan is incentivized through the performance-based incentive. So they have a lot of stake in the game to put together viable plans as well as execute the plan that they put together. And of course, we on DOE side review and approve those plans prior to their being approved, before they're being executed. Oh boy, now this is a good chart. Well, it's my attempt to explain funding. Everybody always wants to ask about funding. Where do you get the money for infrastructure, or common infrastructure for that matter? I don't know if anybody's ever asked that before, but common infrastructure has to be funded. We don't get an appropriation directly. There's not a PBS for infrastructure per se, at least in years in the past. So those dollars for infrastructure have to come from the programs, the PBSs, which everybody's well familiar with, the program baseline summaries for liquid waste, for soil and water remediation, et cetera. So essentially, all those programs, for one, they have to pay for the utilities and other services that they get. So that helps the steam lines, pay for the steam, pay for the electricity bill, et cetera. So those programs have to generate revenue that operates our utility system. And just like any other municipality you may live in, sure, your house, you're in the city limits, you're going to pay for your gas and electric, but you're also going to pay a city tax for things just like we have for those government buildings, for the roads, the garbage pickup, et cetera. So running Savannah Riverside is really nothing more than an exercise in municipal city management. And that's what I'm trying to depict here on this slide. So there's not a whole lot of, it's not really that complicated, so to speak, when you look at it in terms of that analogy. Now, I've talked very briefly about right sizing, and that's one of our strategies. We've got 3 strategies that we attempt to employ when it comes to how we take care of, how we improve, how we recapitalize our common infrastructure. One of those I mentioned, right sizing. And I wanted to call to attention again to our river water system. Big system. We had, there were like 14, 30,000 gallon per minute pumps in 2 large pump stations down on the Savannah River. Kept that water flowing to the 5 heavy water reactors. After they closed, we didn't need that anymore. But we still needed river water for a couple distinct and important missions. One was ensuring that we're able to keep the water levels up in, say, Parr Pond and L Lake. And we also used river water to provide the water necessary for our major steam plant. You've probably heard about the Amoresco steam plant that provides steam for H, F, and S areas. So we're still keeping the river water plants, the river water system operating, but at a much, much, much more reduced level. In fact, we only use 1 7,500 gallon per minute pump at any one time versus a 30,000 gallon per minute pump, which just pulls about a megawatt of electricity in a given hour. So we're able to right size and better operate the plant that way. Innovative solutions. Our electrical provider is SCE&G. They also, we've leased to them to run and maintain our high voltage transmission system. And in the last contract that we put together with them, we've charged them also to recapitalize and modernize that system. So we feel like we were being very innovative in putting that load on SC&G, the folks that do that for a living throughout the state and know what they're doing. And another innovative solution we've employed, of course, is the energy savings performance contracts, which you may have heard of, been briefed on, such as our Amoresco contract for actually 3 of our steam plants. And finally, working with, this is a great lead-in also to Rick, the next briefing, and Crow, we work with Sears Crow a lot for helping us with our infrastructure. And an example of that is a good picture right here. This past summer, we completely repaved Road F, which is a major road for Savannah Riverside, leads from the Aiken Gate all the way to F, H, and S area. And what was key about this, instead of when you repave a road, you have to grind up the existing pavement and usually cart it off to a landfill. But instead, we were able to work with the Crow, and they used that material to use off-site to someone else, another county that needed it, and we were able to use it to improve a secondary road that we have to our Adder Range, to firm it up and improve that road. So that was an innovative solution that we felt like we were able to improve our infrastructure as well as minimize a waste stream from that repavement. And finally, invest in any efficiency savings. Every year we start looking, when we set a budget, we start spending. Of course, there's some conservatism put in. Nobody wants to go spend over the amount they have. But throughout the year, we find that we're hitting our targets, maybe a little bit below. So the site has changed a bit in its philosophy, is that maybe we should take those savings as we achieve those during the year and put them towards our common infrastructure. So that's helped us out quite a bit. And this chart isn't necessarily meant to be an eye chart, but I wanted to throw something up that kind of captures where we are versus where we've been. This is that dashboard I mentioned earlier, and I just took February 2013, roughly 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the site was thinking, they were still coming out of the mode of run to failure. They were still thinking that, you know, the mindset, oh, site will be closing, or at least the EM mission will be over in 15 to 20 years. Why do we need to spend dollars on new roofs or roads? It'll all be falling up. We don't need to do that. So about that time, we were priding ourselves on, you see this drop ceiling in this beautiful room, is the bibs that we would have to catch leaking roof rainwater and how it would funnel it to a bucket that could be easily emptied after a storm. But that was the state. We had several buildings that had this equipment attached to catch rainwater. Isn't that incredible? We had switchgear, electrical switchgear, that had the original 1950s air reservoir tanks that had deteriorated and were so thin that we couldn't allow people around them. We were afraid they could explode. Dawn shaking her head. She remembers that. Heck, it was even less than 5 years ago. We had a firewater tank, for instance, sprung a leak, just deteriorated at the bottom. So we had to go in and patch that. But now, 5 years later, I can't say, we've solved all the common infrastructure problems, but I can say that we don't have any more roofs with specialized structures to catch the rainwater. I could say that those air reservoir tanks and that switchgear, they just got completed. That was a major project, a lot of coordination on, without shutting down K and L areas while we were doing it. That was 13.8 kV voltage there. And that firewater tank we're about 50% done with that project right now. So we hope to have that problem solved. So even though we don't have all green yet, we've got a lot of yellow. We know we have a ways to go, but I think we made steady progress over the last 5 years towards recognizing that our common infrastructure needs some attention too. And how do we do all this? Well, this is just an analogy, and it's like anywhere else. I like to, and what we got here is, I call it teeter-totter, but you got your fulcrum here, and this is what we have to do. There's no magic formula for trying to figure out how much dollars you put towards infrastructure. The site budget is set. We've got to weigh so many different factors, and oh, by the way, all those boxes, I'm sure you could add several more of competing priorities. So it's just up to the site management then where to push the dollars in order to keep this whole thing in balance. And that's all I'm trying to show there, that we don't have a magic formula for it, but it takes good, sound management and judgment every year so that we make the most of the dollars that the site gets. And just a brief, okay, this is the challenges that we do have. We look at our common facilities, first of all. Forcing ourselves, we've really tried to tackle hard the roofs, because if the roofs aren't working, then you can't, repainting, putting in carpet, fixing the HVAC doesn't matter if it's all wet and causing damage. So we pretty well tamed the roofs. We still have more to go, but those aren't completely failed. We look hard at HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, of course. The other thing, we're looking really hard at putting together projects to improve the interiors. And for that tour that all of you, or a few of you went on, we looked at where our protective force, our guard force, where they headquarter out of. And that's our first major renovation for interiors. So we hope to keep that ball rolling. And of course, our fire protection systems as well. Those are critical. They get old, the panels are old, parts become scarce. So that's another of the four major things that we look at, items that we look at for when it comes to facilities. Our transportation, we're started our third major road project here this past spring. We completed what we call Road 2, we did Road F, now we're working on Road C. That's the interstate-like 4-lane road that comes through the middle of the site. So first thing we have to do is replace all the culverts that are there before we can begin repaving. Electrical distribution, again, that's constant. We have to maintain and modernize it so that we can provide reliable power to the programs. Always looking at ways to save energy. That's always a challenge, either through the energy savings performance contracts. Always looking for ways there. We replace our fluorescent lightings with LEDs when they go bad, for instance. Always thinking about that. And finally, this is where it's a big challenge. I mentioned FIMS, the Facility Information Management System. We have a big hole, and that big hole is integrating all our maintenance management systems, procurements, and all that data, and somehow that gets funneled into FIMS. Because FIMS has, I lost count, it's 2,500 lines of infrastructure or real property in it. And each of those lines has 50 to 75 other little attributes that have to be filled out, and they have to be hand put in. And they have things in there like, what was your actual maintenance cost? What's your, how much should you maintain on a system? It's very laborious to maintain, and we've got to improve that. So finally, this is pretty much wraps it up for a common infrastructure, at least for my brief. I see five key pillars there. The thing that helps us put together our plans is consistent funding, resourcing, I should say. I think we pretty much, on top of realistic planning, because it makes no sense to put together a plan that have very little chance to resource, doesn't it? So why put together a plan you can't execute? I believe we hold the SRNS and ourselves accountable by evaluating that plan and incentivizing it. Innovative management can always use work. We're always open to new ideas and ways to approach things, especially working with Rick and his crew. And we've been trying to exercise many of those ideas. And then finally, maintaining a skilled workforce. And that's a tough challenge today, keeping that up. Our SRNS, our contractor, has a thing called a pipeline. They use a lot of the funding that comes in to Landlord Services, who does our infrastructure, our common infrastructure, for hiring new mechanics, getting new blood in, and that knowledge transfer. Still not perfect yet, but we're definitely working on it so that the site could accomplish its mission, not only now, but well into the future. That concludes my presentation for this afternoon, and subject to questions.
Let's start with Doug.
Doug Howard Cap. Great presentation, Dave. And we also had a great tour this time around. And what caught my attention more than anything was you all showing us the renovation of the building there that Centerra will be using. But my question is, how do you prioritize projects like that? Is it the mission essentiality of it, or is it the health hazard risk?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, seriously, all that's worked into. I mean, that would be a separate briefing, but that one tool that we use, the master infrastructure list. Once a project or a need or requirement is reflected on there, there's I want to say almost 10 criteria that are examined and try to balance each other. So things like regulatory, some criteria don't even apply, but definitely, but safety is where a lot of your IH would come into play, and also the mission essentiality definitely ups the score. But in this case, this was one of those projects that once it was revealed how bad the mold was and the water damage was, that's why the site decided to jump on that. But answer to your question, all those criteria are looked at very hard.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jim Gill, CAB. Has there been any analysis or activity looking at solar panels being put on the site to help provide electricity?
Yes, there has been. And we've had at least 2 vendors make proposals. We looked at whether or not they're feasible or not. It didn't get past the conceptual stage. But yes, we've looked at that. We've also looked at that as part of an ESPC as well. Until battery technology, I think, comes mature enough to capture that electricity so that it can be used at night, then I think it should become more viable.
From what we saw earlier, the lab should have you a nice battery pretty soon.
I hope so. Larry?
Thank you, Dave, and we enjoyed the tour you gave us there at the plant too. My question is, do you not have some sort of a schedule of property maintenance? I mean, we all know that a roof has X number of years as a lifetime. It's pretty predictable. We also know that if we wait until the roof fails, it costs a lot more than if we repair it before it fails. Do you not have, carpet lasts X number of years, painting lasts? Do you not have some sort of a property maintenance schedule?
Yes, sir. As we do, when we look at a building, we have a criteria, and we also look at, yes, how long's the roof been there, and we know that, well, the design life of this roof requires replacement. But in many cases, what we'll end up doing is just evaluating it because we don't have funding to replace everything when it's supposed to be replaced. But if it's still functional, we'll put it on our deferred maintenance list and continue to watch it.
So it's more budget-driven than it is need-driven?
Ultimately, yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Tom French, CAP. Thanks for your presentation. I'm amazed at the complexity of the data you got to keep up with. And you really need Watson or somebody that can integrate everything for you. And in a previous life, I did something that was, we were a very small company, a low-cost way to look at new technology implementation. So we got Clemson and South Carolina to form a team each, create a competition. There was a small prize for the winning university. And they came back with concepts how to accomplish a big goal. That might give you some ideas that are floating around those young minds.
Yeah, that would help, definitely. Yeah, especially benchmarking off. SRS does do benchmarking off like-type installations. But I don't know if we've ever approached any institutions like Clemson to help us out.
Okay. Susan?
He's always missing.
Susan Corbett, CAB. A couple of things. So this biomass plant, what is it primarily burning now?
Wood chips.
I'm sorry?
Wood chips.
So that's the primary fuel source. What percentage would you say it was wood chips?
Again, it's in the 90s. It does. If you come down Road 125, you might notice the tire plant. It does burn some chipped up tires as well to keep the BTU level up.
So it's 90% wood?
Again, I think it's more than that, but I'm just going to say it's at least 90%. They don't burn that much of the tire, but.
So why aren't we recycling those tires and using them for asphalt or all kinds of other things?
I can't answer that one.
All right. The solar thing, I find that answer completely ridiculous. We could have a giant solar farm on the property that would power huge areas of Savannah Riverside. That should be something that's a no-brainer. I mean, solar has become ubiquitous around the world. It doesn't need batteries, to contribute to the grid. Let me ask you about these dams. You said there were 2 hazard dams. What bodies of water are they on?
Par Pond.
They're both on Par Pond?
No, Par Pond and what we call L Lake.
L Lake, okay. Are they earthen dams?
Yes.
How old are they?
Oh, I think they again, that was before my time too. They date back to the 50s.
Okay, and are they rated for a certain amount of water or a certain level?
Yes.
What would that be? I mean, are they built to the 100-year or 500-year flood plan?
I'd have to get that number for you. I just looked at it recently, but they're rated for the anticipated rainfall, it is pretty high. I mean, it's above 500, I could say that.
But above 500. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Narinder, is that your card?
Thank you. David, thank you for, I echo what Howard said. We enjoyed our trip on September 5th and showing us some infrastructure. We enjoyed it. I have a question. Since you get the rent from other facilities, so when the facilities decide to upgrade their internet, especially entry points, who's going to pay for that?
That becomes a site management decision. I don't oversee the IT portion, communications, but those are typical projects that go on to the master infrastructure list, and of course the site manager as well as the AMs weigh in on.
Well, another question is about the renewable energy. When you are replacing the roof for the old buildings, would it be possible to plan to have solar panels installed on the roof?
That would be a good idea. We can consider that.
Would you like us to submit a recommendation to you?
Any recommendation would be beneficial. We'll look at it.
Thank you.
We had to hear from you. We'll go over to Greg.
Greg Murray, CAB, thank you again for the tour the other day. It was a wonderful opportunity to learn a lot of stuff. Just quick question I think what was striking to me about your presentation, we've heard this before, was sort of the recognition that the end date is not coming anywhere soon in terms of closing the site down. What does your maintenance schedule tell me I should expect the closure date to be?
We don't have it, I mean, we're not basing our maintenance or on a specific closure date at this time. We don't have a top end.
Is there any time?
As far as what I look at. I mean, I'm looking at pretty much at a 5-year horizon.
Okay. Are there any projects where you're doing maintenance where you say, well, we could maintain this to a level of 30 years, but we're not going to be around in 30 years having to do this, so we're going to only maintain it to 20 years?
No, none.
So you're always, when you're looking at maintaining something, you're always saying, let's get the maximum life out of it, essentially, that's cost effective?
Correct, unless we're going to right size it. A good example would be like the firewater system that we toured. There's a service water system also in conjunction with that. So we're looking at, do we really need that? So we're studying whether or not we could just use domestic water to provide the water that the service water currently provides, for instance. So we are always looking at infrastructure that maybe not be needed to retire.
Thank you very much.
Joyce.
Joyce Underwood, CAB. So, bearing all this in mind that you have told us, in your expert opinion, what area has the greatest need and or is the most likely to fail if it is not addressed?
Well, for common infrastructure, we're concentrating on our facilities where people reside permanently.
So buildings.
Building is what
roofs.
What I feel like. Well, roofs as well as the interiors. We're maintaining those as best we can. But I think several of our facilities are not as bad, but are coming close to the building that we toured on 5th September. But that's where I feel like our priorities should be.
Okay, thank you.
But it's got to be across the board. We're also, roadways, we feel are essential too for the long-term viability of the site.
Okay, so follow-up question. What would you like us to do with this information? How can we help you? Did I put you on the spot?
No, I wish I could say, well, talk to our delegation about funding, but we don't.
I can't.
But there's not a mechanism for that, of course. Actually, I just continued support and whatever good ideas, such as panels on roofs or solar farms. That always helps. We're always willing to run down suggestions and see if we could do it better, cheaper.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Any other questions for Dave? As somebody who drives on the site, thank you for the roads. Thanks, Dave. All right. And next up, we have Rick Mcleod with the Community Reuse Organization.
You leaving? Just as soon as I walk up, you leave. This is about the fourth time, I guess, I've talked to the cab. Some familiar faces, some new faces. What's changed for me is, some of you not aware, I have a soul patch now that I used to not have the last time I talked to y'all. It's also called a jazz dot or a moosh. And if you don't believe me, you can Google it. And it's actually, my wife says it's really a latent middle life crisis that I'm going through. I just didn't want those in the back to think that I got white out on my lower lip. And do they even have white out? I don't even know if you can buy white out anymore. So I'm here to talk mainly about, I'm doing the middle. Oh, I got to cut it on. At the request, so again, I'm here at the request of the Strategic and Legacy Management Committee, give you an update on the Community Reuse Organization, for the newbies, what we are, for the folks that have been around, a little bit update on what we're doing and what we have been doing over the last couple of years. So my agenda, I'm going to talk about 4 items. One is excess surplus assets from the site. Dave was a good lead in to that. I'll get into the issues related to our organization gets surplus equipment from the site, and then we're able to sell that and reuse that towards some of our existing programs. Workforce, we hadn't heard that today, but I'll be talking a little bit about that. Cyber collaboration, I think Julie mentioned cyber, and you'll hear, this is kind of out of the CAB's preview, but it's something we're working on. I thought it might be interesting for y'all to hear about. And last is high-level waste definition grassroots effort. Ties into Don's recommendation. We've been working on the issue since 2013, so it's been 5 years effort that we've been on. We do not call it, we call it redefining, because if you call it reclassifying, it gets into a lot of legal mumbo that you don't want to get into. So I'll touch base on that if we get some time going forward. So a little bit about the SRS Community Reuse Organization. This is actually our 25th year anniversary as an organization. We were originally called SARDI, if you thought SRS CRO was bad. So SARDI was formed in the 1993s. We were designated as a community reuse organization in 1996. We changed the name in 2006. I came on board as the executive director, now president, CEO, in 2008. So I've been there 10 years to date. Some of y'all may be military background. So a CRO is similar to a redevelopment authority. If you remember the BRAC closures and how they closed bases and they set up a redevelopment authority to try to find alternative uses, other economic development issues for the BRAC, for the military installations. DOE did the same thing in the early 90s. Some of you may remember K-reactor restart. Have you ever heard that? But the site was looking at actually restarting one of the reactors back in the about this time frame, late 90s, early 90s, I'm sorry. At that time, that project went away. So the site had 25,000 people at one time when the K-reactor restart project was on board. They went from 25,000 down to about 14,000. So we saw a similar workforce transition that the BRAC closures were seeing. This was happening across the DOE complex. So they set up these community reuse organizations. There were 15 across the DOE complex. There are 8 that exist today. Our board is made up of 22 members, 11 from Georgia and 11 from South Carolina. People say, well, the site's in South Carolina, why do you have Georgia board members? Well, a third of the workforce lives in Georgia and drives to the site. So go back to the reason we were set up. When we lost a workforce, significant workforce, some of those were from the Georgia side as well. So that's why we were set up in that situation. We're a private, nonprofit, 501c3 organization. I think the site gets our bills sometimes and pay them because we have SRS in our name. I'm just kidding, not really, Lisa. But anyway, we are not associated with the site, except our mission is to look at workforce, economic development, maintaining missions, or maintaining the jobs. So again, I kind of touched base on this, but we're involved in what we call the Asset Transition Program. Again, we get surplus equipment from the site. It's at our cost to remove it from the site, but we do not get charged for the excess equipment. Then we're able to sell that equipment, and then we're able to use those dollars for programs that we have set up. And I'm going to touch base on some of those. Dave was a good lead-in to this. Let's see. Yeah, it does work. So you heard Dave talking about common infrastructure. There's your 45 years. The programmatic infrastructure is over 60 years. What I do is equate infrastructure to equipment. So the stuff we get is not like brand new, right? It's really probably in this category. So we're getting not new stuff, and that'll be significant when I get to another slide here. So, and there's probably not a great heading here, but this is not the headquarters of the CRO. And our subcontractor, BMG, this is not the headquarters of BMG. Now, there's a misconception at the site that we're getting filthy rich out of all of this equipment coming from the site. So I wanted to present to the cab the actual numbers that you can see. All right, because actually how many have participated, been, or held a yard sale? Come on, some of y'all have been, right? So you put something out on there that you, paid $200 for, and you get 25 cents for it? But to you, it's worth $200, right? Well, the site feels that same way. They have something called acquisition value, all right? In words, this is what they bought that piece of equipment 45 years ago, right? So to them, it's worth millions and millions of dollars. Well, it's only worth to us what somebody's willing to pay for it, just like a yard sale, right? So we actually did an exercise and looked at what is our gross sales on acquisition value. Now, this is not every individual piece of equipment, but this was a summary. I think we looked at maybe 10 to 15 items in our worksheets. So this is what we found out. 2015, 11 cents, 2.5, 2.4, 5 cents. Over a 3-year total, the acquisition value at the site for all this equipment was $3.7 million. Now, I could have probably had a castle, right? This is my corporate headquarters. But in actuality, we get 6 cents on the acquisition dollar. So just a misconception I want folks to realize, even though we get all this equipment, it's kind of old. Sometimes we can't even find people to operate it, it's so old. So again, we're not making our corporate headquarters out of castles. But I'm going to tell you what we do with it. This is the site benefits, and I'll get to it fairly quickly. Again, reduces disposition costs. They don't have to dispose of them. The site used to do an auction. Employees would come in. Dawn may have been there when they did that earlier. Tom might have been there. The problem is it costs the site a lot of money to even hold those auctions, and then you got a 1 day's dollar amount for what people were willing. You had a yard sale that day. We actually hold things for commodities. If the price goes up for steel, we don't have to unload steel that day. We can hold it. We can bundle things. So we try to maximize our profits as we go through this. This is Andy Albanese's quote here, I believe. Andy's in the audience as well. Spending $1 to take a nickel's worth of trash. The site has been known to do that. And we're being stewards of the taxpayer's dollar. We're trying to actually come in and provide a mechanism to decrease that amount. So what we've done, actually, the site economic benefits over the 7-year cost reduction has been about $9 million. For a small organization, that's not too bad. We have removed, I think last time I talked about railroad, we've removed rail lines, abandoned rail lines, steam lines at the site. We did that for the asset cost. So in other words, it didn't cost the site any money. We came in, removed the rail, and then we had a disposition path for the rail. Our costs were paid by the actual asset that we removed. And we're now going into doing trailers. If some of y'all visited the site loves trailers. I mean, they just love them. And they're like rabbits out there for some reason because they are reproducing all the time. Trailers we get, though, are 15 years older or more. So we're getting the old trailers, and we went through an exercise actually to remove 5 trailers. We tried to reuse them. We tried to determine if we could actually use the steel from them. It costs more money to remove a trailer off-site than it does to actually try to reuse it. So we said, what if we demolish the trailers for you in return for assets, other assets at the site? So that's what we've accomplished to date. There's over 70, I think, on our list. I think we're up to about 50 that we've done to date, so that's moving along. What's they're called, kick and count. A lot of these Sealand containers, you know, those things with the doors that swing open, the site loves those too. There's a bunch of them there, and they're full of like tools and hand tools and all those types of things. So the site actually ended up, the old way was they recorded every hand tool, like every 1/4 inch wrench or 3/4 inch wrench, and everyone had to be documented. We came up with, what if we just bundle that together and called it kick and count, and this was the number. We actually weighed it versus what we sold, so there was a mechanism to audit the process. Potential future savings, Thomas, I've still got the gondola cars up there. We're looking at, the site has 50 gondola cars. If they remain, they're either going to fall apart or they're going to have to be put in the E area trenches and disposed of at a significant cost. So we've actually come up with a company that would reuse them for their intended purpose, which is for waste removal. So we're trying to get that across and let the DOE use us as a broker to this company that would like to use those. Another one is the National Guard. I think Zach is back there. Todd is. We've had some meetings, just nothing, just but discussions, but it would be interesting. There's a water tower in D area that could use some C4 on it, and for you not familiar with C4, they could blow the legs off of it, it would fall down, and then we would use the scrap metal. And then they would actually have a training exercise on how to blow up a water tower or whatever else they want to claim that it is. So those are some things in the future that we're working on as far as the asset side. So what do we use the money for? You can follow on the sheets. I think it's kind of hard to read from the back, or I couldn't read it from the back. These are our pots of money, if you will, or programs. We actually, in 2014, one time we dispersed $200 million per county. I have a 5-county area. Each county got $200,000 that went to economic development in that county. So that was $1 million right off the top of our asset funds that went to the counties for economic development. We then set up a $50,000 per year per county account that would have to be matched by the economic developers. That was the second economic development pot of money. We also have something called workforce education and training. I'm going to get to that next and talk to you about what we're doing on workforce. We do a lot of community issues. You can see there the list of the type of things we get into. Every 5 years we do an SRS economic impact study. That before used to be done way back when with Westinghouse when they were the contractor. Now it's been multiple contractors. There's not one entity to do that, so we picked up that effort because what the site provides to the community is a very significant economic impact, and it needs to be documented and recorded. And then I mentioned the asset revitalization. It does cost us money to remove things, so we have to have a pot of money there to be able to provide funds to start the process off. So here's our commitments that we have done over the 5-year period, not counting the $1 million that we gave away, right? We gave that off the top. So here are the typical projects that we have used under those program dollars that you saw before. So to date, in the 5 years since we've started this new program, we've done close to $3.5 million out in the local community from the reuse organization. Being a regional organization, that's fairly significant, in my opinion. So workforce, I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. This is our nuclear workforce initiative. We started it before Plant Vogtle was actually getting started. VC Sumner was also in the works. We won't go into that topic, but we needed a nuclear workforce. The site has 11,000 people now. A year or two ago, they were saying 50% could retire in the next 5 years. There's a significant quantity of retirements that are happening. Even if VC Sumner goes away, it does look like Plant Vogtle is going to continue, that we need young people to work in the nuclear field. And when I say nuclear field, it's not nuclear engineers. It's engineers of every type, procurement, legal, contracting, craft people, mechanics. The site has a whole 11,000 people are not just nuclear engineers or scientists at the site. So hopefully y'all realize that or can appreciate that large number. What we kind of the rubber band, if you will, that kind of works between the regional employers, economic development, educational institutions. We're more the facilitators that tries to work out in the community to work on workforce issues. So we've had, previously I'd come and talked about an answer grant that we got from DOE back, I guess it was about 6-7 years ago. It's finished. We actually received almost $4 million in that grant. That grant was used to set up programs like the Rad Tech program at Aiken Technical College, like the welding class at Aiken Technical College. Augusta Technical College has an operator training class that was set up for Plant Vogtle. We set up programs at USC Aiken and at USC Salkehatchie, you can see, and Augusta University as well. We're now operating under what's called the Workforce Grant, and I'll touch a little bit more on it. To date, we're at $1.4 million. So you can see in total, we've given almost $5.5 million through the grants, through us, out to the colleges. And what's significant, if some of y'all have worked for academic institutions, their overhead rate is not exactly small. So with a nonprofit organization, we charge DOE 5% overhead rate to administer the grant. So in most cases, it means more dollars can go on the ground to the workforce needs as opposed to go into just overhead within the colleges. So WORK stands for Workforce Opportunities in Regional Careers. We say real impacts, real people, and real jobs. And the reason is that we set it up so that it would be all those universities I mentioned are part of the partnership. We set it up because we learned from the initial grant what's key is scholarships. These kids need, some of them really need the scholarships to go to school. Another one is marketing. The schools need to market their program because the young kids don't know what they don't know, and they don't know there's a need in the nuclear field, so we got to market those. And then there's also some stuff we called the 2-in-2 engineering program. We also, not part of the grant, but it's very key to the grant, is that work experiences. You can call it internships, whatever you want to call it. The young folks need an opportunity to work. One thing is so they understand what the site's like, and the folks at the site understand what they're like. So it's beneficial to both parties to figure out, is this a fit for me or not? Because fitness for duty, what these young kids decide to do in their time away from or extracurricular activities, do not always fit with working in a nuclear facility. So that's key to the whole process. I think the next one is, so what have we done to date? This is through August. We've actually awarded the schools, the partnership, 450 scholarships in 27 different education and training programs. They range, of course, I'm talking about tech schools to universities, so there's not a dollar amount that's uniform across them. They range from $500 to $3,300 per student. We know we've had 102 students selected for internships at the site. What's been key is the sites, even their maintenance folks are retiring. And they used to not have a internship for the craft level type of people. So we're saying, well, why don't you have some of those come out and start working in a work experience program out of the tech schools so that they can get a feel for what goes on as well. So that's happened as well. We have meetings with the employers. There's 6. We also include the Plant Vogel in some of those as well. And we're working on promotional strategies. Now this is a real new one. This is we've leveraged this off of the DOE grants, and some of the times you don't see those tangible benefits or people do not aware of them. But Allendale, this is strictly the Allendale school system. We're looking at STEM mentoring, maker-centered learning systems. Any educators in the room? And then local advisory committee. This was not a large award, $50,000, but it just shows you the leverage that a potential DOE grant can lead us into. So this is a real great program for the Allendale school system and to try to get those folks involved in STEM careers. All right, changing up. Cyber study, not under your preview, so I'm going to go through. You got the slides in front of you quickly. Julian mentioned cyber being the hot buzzword, and we feel the same way. We had a concept, well, we've got this thing called the Army Cyber Command moving into Fort Gordon in Augusta, right across the river. Why couldn't we build synergy between that DOD initiative and DOE? And when I talk about, I'm not talking about NNSA necessarily or EM. I'm talking about big DOE. I'm talking about the whole energy sector. And I'm talking about national security, homeland security. So it's not affiliated with any of the existing missions we have. This would be a brand new mission. So what if we were to bring 100 to 200 people in a specific cyber mission to the site? How would we do that? So this is the report. Actually, I'll get to it a little bit later. You can go to our website. Our newsletter today actually has a link that you can go to get more information about it. We're in phase 2 now. I'll go over a little bit of phase 1, what we found related to the site. So we were looking at all these items in the phase 1 study. You know, what's the energy sector landscape? What's the future needs of DOE? What's our regional capabilities? Does the site have the infrastructure from a workforce capacity to handle it? Why SRS? Why would it be looked at from this standpoint? And some of the strategic partnerships that are going on in the SRS region. The study conclusions, they felt the site was ideally positioned and equipped to assist in national security mission and defense of the energy grid. And these are some things that they thought the site could be used for. Those are different items that we're trying to investigate. Is there a need? Where would that come from? Which organization would look at doing those? Probably can't see this. I'll point out just a few. There are regional synergies, collaboration, going back to Fort Gordon and their cyber initiative. They have a role in critical infrastructure. You heard Dr. Majihi talk about that earlier this morning. Development costs in our region compared to Silicon Valley are pretty low. So it's attractive to folks. Investment growth is low cost of living. They have already some of the stuff that the lab is doing is robust in cybersecurity and hygiene. One key point is the site. Some of y'all have toured the site. You know, only 10% of the 310 square miles has ever been used for industrial applications, right? So you probably saw more pine trees than you saw facilities. So there's a lot of the site that is open area. You could put a grid there, a practice grid. It wouldn't have to be live. You could test things. You could try cyber activities. So the land mass, it was a benefit that this consulting phase 1 study folks thought would be beneficial. Those are the high points. Again, this is kind of more of a verbal representation of what we just went over. There are currently academic institutions. I mentioned our grant with the With the 5 colleges that already exist, so there's a lot of talent in the area coming in from Fort Gordon, from their cyber activities. So there's a lot of synergy to make this happen. So we're now starting a socialization effort. And if you would go on the website, our website, srscro.org, you will find hopefully it's up, a page that talks about community issues, and under that community issues will be a write-up on this ICIT study, Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. They're a think tank in DC that handles cyber type of activities, and they're looking at socializing this effort. You'll be seeing Splash on social media talking about those things. So we're trying to make folks aware that it exists and become a catalyst to try to get some cyber collaboration at Savannah Riverside. But with that comes a legislative strategy. You've got to have a champion. You've got to have money, right? As y'all all know, it always comes down to the money. Which program office has the need and who's going to have the money to fund such an initiative? So that's going to be another step moving forward. There are discussions about like a cyber first responder. You know, we just had the hurricane, you had first responders going. What happens if there's a cyber attack and we have no way of having any first responders to help with the major cyber attack? There's some discussion of actually setting up some type of first responders in the cyber field, similar almost like a cyber National Guard. So that's what we're hoping we can parlay some of that thought process into something at the site. All right, changing again. Now we're going back to Don's favorite topic. Defense waste definitions. Why we started with this is this term right here, high-level waste. We're the only country that defines high-level waste because of its origin. We do not define high-level waste based upon the chemical composition of the waste, all right? And the reason, or one of the definitions, how do you quantify highly radioactive material? There's no number there, right? It's all subjective, insufficient concentrations. So that's why we said we're not trying to reclassify high-level waste, we're trying to help clarify the definition of high-level waste. Back in 2013, I'll go to another slide, the site has actually done some micro batching of the vitrified waste, and lo and behold, they believe there's 2,300 canisters of the vitrified waste is actually true waste by definition. Therefore, if that's true, it wouldn't necessarily have to go to Yucca Mountain, of course, which doesn't exist, but it wouldn't have to go to a repository. It could go to WIP, or it could go to Waste Control Specialists, which is a private disposal facility in Texas. So again, this was back in 2013. I just got back from the Rad Waste Conference. I used this slide there. This guy's retired from DOE now, but even then he was talking about 2,300 canisters and that there would be significant tax revenue savings from doing a redefining the high-level waste. When I say significant, we have been told $40 billion, and we have been told $40 billion is on the low side. That's savings across the DOE complex that then could be used towards cleanup dollars if that's the decision to made. So like Hanford's very interested in this, or some folks in Hanford. The Department of Ecology is not too enamored with it, but there's a lot of savings that we could plow back in, maybe expedite the liquid waste tank, Shelley, at the site. So who knows? So we're pushing forward with our work on this. So in 2013, we actually paid and took some of our community leaders to Carlsbad. We actually went down in WIP. It's very interesting. If you've never been, it's worth the trip out there. You go down into the salt mine, and actually, if you listen to the folks telling you, the salt is actually moving, constantly moving. And eventually, over time, it will come around and encapsulate the waste that is down there. So the drums that are down there will actually, due to the pressure, actually get collapsed, but the salt will actually encapsulate the waste. Our waste, which is glass, would be ideal. I mean, it may break, but crack or whatever. But again, there's no way for the waste to get out of the glass logs. they were very receptive to the idea. At that time, we were thinking about maybe 4 years we'd be able to move along. That's 2013, that was last year. We would be in a situation that we could move this along. Does anybody know what happened in February of 2014? February, March-ish? WILP had a little fire on one of their utility trucks down in the mine, and they had kitty litter ignited. And so WILP was shut down for 2 years, 2.5 years. So we kind of went on hold for a while because there wasn't much we could do, right? We couldn't, if WILP was not the avenue for disposition, we were lost. But luckily, waste control specialists came in and they are talking about possibly getting permitted for true waste as well. Back in 2013, we even socialized this with congressional staffers. We met with Shelley and talked about it as well. There were no big roadblocks at that time of why this potentially couldn't work from a state level and even at New Mexico level. But again, the hiccups happened and we ended up kind of putting things on hold. And then we also ran into this thing that people, anybody familiar with Occam's razor, it's basically sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. But when you work with the field that we're in, a lot of times people will say, well, you can't do that because, or that's not the way we've done it, or I'm sorry, but you know, when we developed this regulation, this was why it was developed. So, but I still believe sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. So we were looking at revising the whole flow chart. Instead of having an end-do loop as far as there was no repository, we were going to say if the radionuclides basically were less than Class C waste, you go down to the true waste definition, right? 100 nanocuries per gram of alpha emitting waste. If we did that, then you would have a disposition path to WILP. And now I'm talking about defense waste. I'm not talking about commercial spent fuel here, so keep that in mind. So we came up with a real simple legislative language we were hoping to put in. And you can see it there at the bottom. Again, it mainly based upon regardless of origin. Because again, we're the only country that based the waste definition and disposition based upon the origin, not the classification of the material. So again, I mentioned waste control specialists. They came back into the picture and we started looking at a current objective. And we were working with Energy Community Alliance and they'll come up in a slide or two forward. This goes back to Kelly's WEIR. If you remember, DOE actually has the authority to classify their waste, all right? And they did it prior to the 3116 through the DOE Order 35.1. And I'll touch a little bit based on that. However, when DOE did that, they got sued and got sued a lot. And they ended up bailing on the 435.1 authority because they put it in abeyance because of the lawsuits. All right, so you see the red thing? I'm not going to read them for y'all. Hopefully you'll read those. So again, the order could be contested at its first use. In other words, if it's used again, 435.1, you can imagine there are going to be additional lawsuits. So DOE right now is looking at doing that again. We were trying to get them to say, just like Senator Graham under 3116 and WEIR, would it make more sense to get congressional support at the same time that you plan on using that order that you were sued before doing? Wouldn't that make sense? So I worked with the Energy Communities Alliance. That's a group of local elected officials from communities around the DOE complex. There was actually interest. There's the paper that they put out on it. It's actually a well-written paper, worth the read if you'd like to read it. We proposed a two-pronged strategy. What if we do both? DOE, go ahead with your 35.1 authority changes, but at the same time, why don't we codify the statutory change and make it law so it cannot be changed? That's the simple approach that has not quite gotten there yet. So that simple definition that I talked about that we had originally in 2013, this is what it currently looks like. So if you get more cooks in the kitchen, your recipe ends up getting more things added to it. So this was in an effort to actually do some things that Washington State, the ecology department, was wanting to get into the definition. It's not really the wording of the definition, it's just getting that whole concept of regardless of origin out and look at the chemical composition of the waste. So actually, Congress thought that was a good idea last November, November of last year, and they put it in the National Defense Authorization Act under Section 3139. And they asked DOE, okay, you know, it may not be a bad idea. How about Mr. Secretary, or Miss Secretary, Mr. this time, how about run through these 7 items and give us this for study, a report from you that identifies all this before we make a final decision. Well, the report was due to Congress February of 2013, not this coming February. The report has not materialized yet. So DOE, Dawn, is moving forward with Thor 35.1. We keep hearing, I'd heard it was going to be at the Waste Management Conference in March. We didn't get it. I'd heard it might be out last week at the National Cleanup Caucus, but it wasn't out then. So it's going to be, for one reason or another, we hadn't gotten it out of DOE, and we can't seem to get the data which would actually help support this whole initiative out of DOE either. So right now we're in kind of a stalemate to wait until the order actually gets out and see what changes are made with it. And that's all I had for y'all.
So I know that we're probably going to have a lot of questions, especially on the high-level waste definitions. Let's keep in mind that they need to be questions that he can answer. Okay? All right. Let's do it, Don.
You mean I have a choice?
Dawn Gillis Cab. Thank you. There's a lot of great information in here, and I really had no idea there was this much going on with that waste definition, and it had started before the WIP issues. So this is really what I'm going to keep.
One other I didn't mention, I was on a call yesterday. Remember CRESP? Do y'all remember CRESP? You remember CRESP? They're also looking at this high-level waste definition.
So that's great. Okay, so ours is just another little piece that says, yeah, we agree. A much smaller issue, from the surplus stuff that you have, is there somewhere that the public can go and buy tools or something like that from you guys?
They can. We actually put it on what's called Gov Deals. It's like a website for government surplus that you can, it's like eBay for government materials. You can bid on it as well.
.com?
Gov Deals.
Govdeals.com, but not .gov.
Not .com. It's a special website that deals in government surplus. You can get by a tank or
I don't think
whatever.
I need one of those.
I mean, that type of stuff on it.
I could use some tools. Okay, thank you very much. That was a great presentation.
Joyce?
Joyce Underwood Cab. First of all, I'm going to go on govtools.com and look for a mimeograph machine because why not? But my question is not about high-level waste. My question is about your programs with the colleges. So you have a lot of like trade jobs out there, pipe fitters, I assume, iron workers, yeah?
Well, I don't have any of
Oh,
them.
no, but the site has those kinds of jobs,
has
yes?
some trades. When you say trades, are you talking about union jobs or non-union?
Well, I don't know the
The site has
difference,
both.
so that's what I'm asking you
And
about.
that might be a good presentation for the site folks to present to the cab, would be what's the makeup of the workforce.
I think we had one like that. I just am ignorant to the difference between a union job
There's
and a
not as
non-union job.
many unionized as you would think. Most of those are related to Davis-Bacon, if my memory is correct. Davis-Bacon is the construction type of jobs, and those have a mandated amount that have to be union laborers.
So because of the makeup of the workforce and all that, there's not any need to have a relationship with trade unions like you're forming with the colleges?
They do, and we have tried to do that with them earlier on. The challenge you have with that, if you've ever worked with the trade unions, is there are many of them.
Yeah.
So you'll have a pipe fitter, and then you'll have a carpentry, and then you'll have XYZ, and part of the problem, they don't talk together. If they would come together under their own training, it would be a lot easier, but it's hard to work with the painting labor force and not the carpentry, or it has not been as easy to figure out a fix.
I see. And my other question has to do with your security and your cyber research. Do you know, and you might not know because I don't know whose purview this would fall under, has there ever been a security assessment by like a outside firm to see what the holes in security, cyber and otherwise might be?
At the site?
At the site.
I don't know.
You don't know, okay. Somebody answer for me later. Thank you.
All right, Doug?
Doug Howard Cap. Rick, my question for you is and it may be a question that's way out there, but the land here on the site, do you think it will ever be up for public use? And if it was, would you all be part of the team to?
Well, we looked at that 6 years ago, I think. Shelley was involved in those discussions of an energy park at the site, that we may put in a small modular reactor, some type of energy-related industrial complex, if you would, and then each one of those would save from the infrastructure going in, and where each one wouldn't have to have their own. We'd make an energy island. Timing on that was not very good, so that kind of fell to the wayside, but we actually did a meets and bounds on 2,600 acres at the site that could be utilized for industrial applications. It's finding the right mix and the right time. Now, the land at the site will probably never be used for public use. When you say public, residential, golf course, condos, there won't be any condos at Par Pond, I do not believe, at least probably not as long as I live. So no, there won't be a public use from that standpoint. But it is a very nice piece of property from an industrial standpoint, looking at economic development. You've got a geographic boundary around it. You've got some, it's not a city right next to it. There's a lot of interesting things that the economic developers would want for a certain piece of industrial company that may come in there. The site, basically, I think agreement with DHEC is that it will always remain under government ownership. So the only way to be able to do the industrial side would be actually to get a long-term lease of the property. Other CROs have actually got leases, but they've also got fee simple land donated to them from other DOE sites. So there is a precedent that this has been done. We just haven't done it at SRS to date. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Zach, did you want to expand on that?
DOE. Just kind of echoing what Rick said, we do actually have a process on the site. We have a land use committee team that actually fields requests for different land utilizations. I can't tell you to date how many have been approved, but there is a process that we have established that we do receive requests, that we're looking at a lot of these proposals and such. So I imagine sometime in the near future there will be eventually something that kind of comes down the line that'll be a good fit that meets DOE's mission and strategic intent and is allowed something that's not necessarily at the site right now to take use of some of the land.
There's a land around the perimeter of the site that if they got DX approval could be transferred without causing any problems with their agreements with DHEC. But internal to the site, it probably will never be a fee simple or you own the land. It'll probably always be under some type of DOE or federal ownership.
Eleanor?
Eleanor Hobson Cab. I really appreciate the information. It's extensive and will answer a lot of questions, especially for new CAB members, but old CAB members needed the information as well. Also, SRS CRO workforce grants, are they only available to the students who attend the colleges listed?
Under our formation, remember we're a 5-county organization, even giving out assets to, like, for an industry coming in, we could actually give an old locomotive to attract them into the area. It has to be one of those 5 counties. So those schools that you see are in those 5 counties. That's why we have concentrated on those. Unless DOE changes the model, that's what we're currently operating under, with just those 5 schools.
Thank you. Any additions you think in the future?
Only if DOE decides to do something different with it. And there is a new human capital person. She actually used to be Candace Trummel, now Candace Robertson. And we've actually talked to her about some of these issues. You know, the site has a lot of young folks that are being hired due to the retirements. Clearances are taking, it was 24 months. Is it down to 18 or less now for getting a site clearance? Maybe it's still 18 to 24. When they come on, as they put yourself when we were young, it's hard for me to remember, but we were at one time, I guess, right? You got hired, you wanted to go to work immediately. Well, if you go out to the site, if you're working in a cleared area or a classified area, you can't until you get your clearance, right? So what are you going to do for a year and a half or 2 years when you're hired to be a chemical engineer in XYZ, but you can't be a chemical engineer in XYZ because you don't have your site clearance? So one of the options we said, wouldn't it be neat if we used those young people as mentors in the middle school system in the 5-county area, 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, give them some connection to the local community. So we're offering suggestions. I don't know what she'll come up with or what she'll look at, but she's a good lady, so we hope she'll come up with some ideas.
What is her name?
Candace Robertson.
Okay. Candace, thank you.
Sorry, Thomas, you had some,
Yes,
you
I
wanted to
also
expand?
want to
I'm in trouble now.
I guess
I'm in trouble, Thomas?
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Also, I mean, Rick has, I guess, kind of access to and control over the work grant, but there are other grants that we have on site. As an example, we've got one with the historically black colleges and universities where we spend approximately $8 million or so per year with the HBCUs, which covers all of the HBCUs in South Carolina and Payne College in Georgia. And we also have specific grants with University of South Carolina and with Clemson as well. That's not covered by this particular presentation.
And this was not a listed grant. We actually unsolicited the first grant and were able to negotiate. So this was not a grant that you could go on Gov Grants or Grant.gov or whatever it is and actually find a solicitation. So we actually worked on this unsolicited through DOE to get the grant.
Okay. Doug, did you have some follow-ups?
Doug Howard Cap, I did have one more question. I know you said, Rick, that you used, you employed the National Guard to
We were discussing the possibility. We're not using them as yet.
So it has not been done yet?
No, ma'am. No, sir.
Okay.
It's only in the beginning discussions, just to see if there's a possibility.
Okay. Well, just while you're on that, another food for thought, chemical units, the Army has those, as we know. Have you all ever thought about employing them to do various exercises or cleanup or decontamination stuff around?
I don't know if the site has, Todd we're willing to work with the Guard any way that we can. And your training exercise is the right word to use because they would use it as training exercises. But I'll let Zach talk to that.
DOE, Rick, I think you hit it. We don't like to use the word employed. We like to use the word match training requirements to work being done on site. So we're not employing or contracting out with the National Guard. We're just matching training requirements. Now, to date, we primarily been with engineers with the, I think Mike Mcleod mentioned yesterday, the 288 ash basin, as well as some miscellaneous projects around the site. We have talked with some burning units, but you look at the skill sets of those units and the complex issues that we have on site, it's probably not a good match.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Rick? No? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from around the table? Things that we didn't hit today or didn't hit hard enough? What do we need to talk about? Dave is like, talk about nothing, go home. Anything else? Anything that we need to do? Doug, will you close it out for us?
Yes. I'd like just to say thanks to everybody that supported this full board meeting. And everybody drive home safely and have a great week. This meeting is adjourned.